I'm Professor of Ecosystem Science here and Director of our Centre for Nature Recovery. And we have these biodiversity seminars, which are now rebranded Nature Network seminars, typically every Friday off term time. But given our exceptional visitor, we made an exception and have a Tuesday seminar today to kick off this academic series. But if you're interested in for the Friday seminars, do try and register online so we have an idea of numbers for these events. But every Friday in this lecture theatre for this term at 4:15 p.m. And just to give you a flavour of the next few weeks, this Friday we have a seminar, which is David Farrier from the University of Edinburgh, talking about nature's genius, evolution's lessons for a changing planet. That draws on what can we learn from evolutionary history about how biodiversity will respond to current changes. And then we also have, next week we've got Hugh Warwick, who's a local author, talking about killing for conservation and the challenges and trade-offs between killing in order to restore biodiversity and regenerate ecosystems. And there's a whole range. We've got Ciaran Sumner the week after, who's a lecturer at University College London, who's written a wonderful book about wasps and how amazing wasps are. And there's a whole range of things coming up. And so after the seminar today, we will be having a informal drinks conversation in the Atmosphere room, which is just around the corner. So you're all welcome to join and have an informal conversation there. And but I'll forget later on, as well as today's talk, Dave Tilman is talking tomorrow at the Martin School on Broad Street at 5 o'clock. And that's a seminar about particularly about biofuels and how they fit into the sustainability dilemma around providing both food from the land surface and sustaining the conservation. So that'll be a fascinating seminar. Do register on the Martin School website if you want to go to that one as well. That's also being live online. And welcome to our online audience as well. So moving on to today's speaker, Dave Tilman is the Regents Professor and McKnight Presidential Chair in Ecology at the University of Minnesota, and also holds a professorship at the University of California in Santa Barbara Brent School. And he's widely recognized for his pioneering work that blends both mathematical theory and long-term experimental ecology that shows how the links between biodiversity and ecosystem function and productivity and carbon storage, including long-term pioneering experiments in Minnesota that have been hugely influential in ecological thinking. And since his earliest career, he's extended his research into critical questions around sustainable agriculture, global food demand, and species conservation, which we'll hear more about tomorrow as well. And his work has not only reshaped ecological science, but is influencing policy and practice around the world. So thank you very much, Dave, for joining us. And over to you.
Well, my pleasure, and it's a delight to be here. I apologize for my accent. I'll tell you a little story. John Krebs, who's a friend of mine, and I were driving out to Charles Godfrey's house, and I was reading the directions. And John said something to me. I said, John, if you would speak in English, I would understand you. And then I realized I was speaking and hearing American. And anyway, so, and he hasn't let me forget that one yet, of course. There's a good friend who would never let you forget something like that. So I want to talk about diversity in a very broad sense. I was intrigued by why the world had so many species as a graduate student, and how so many species that would need the same kinds of aspects of their environment, the same resources, could compete with each other and coexist. And this is not just a question I've asked. Many ecologists over the last 50 years have asked this question. I'm going to try to tie together sort of, this is my 50th year as a professor. How about that? The last 50 years of my life into a 45-minute talk. So let me sort of show you what I have here. So origins of biodiversity, the impacts of biodiversity, and the potential fate that we'll be looking at. So this is the center figure is what I want you to look at. It shows the number of families of animals and plants, higher animals and plants, if you will, on Earth, and how that number has changed from basically the Cambrian explosion until the present time. And now there are about 2,500 families. Remember, after family, you have genus, then species. So there are lots of genera and lots of species in each genus, giving us a total of perhaps 5 or so million different species living on Earth. And when you look at this, the one thing when I saw this, I thought, wow, that is quite interesting. Diversity has been increasing, not quite continuously. The downticks tend to be mass extinction events, but really increasing in a fairly regular way for the last 550 million years, something like that, which is interesting because what that suggests is that as new species formed, they must have coexisted with lots of the current species. Because if each new species was better than something else that was there and displaced it, diversity would never have gone up that way. Gone up from a few species to 5 million species, from a few families to 2,500 families of plants and animals. So coexistence must have been likely. And it was a mystery when I started, and it's pretty much mathematically resolved, but not experimentally resolved, what the solution to that mystery is. And I want to quote Darwin. How many of you have actually read The Origin of Species? Good work, wonderful. And those of you who haven't, it really is a fun book. He was a smart guy, amazingly good naturalist, the kind of people we barely ever have in our discipline anymore, who know many different kinds of organisms, look at them, think about them, and so on. And he said, here's a quote I love from it: each new species is produced and maintained by having some advantage over those with which it comes in competition. And that'll be a big point we discuss here. He then said, the extinction of old forms is the almost inevitable consequence of the production of new forms. I've already refuted that when I showed you the fossil record, correct? No one is perfect. I've made millions of mistakes. Darwin made one mistake, but he didn't really make a mistake. He had a very incomplete fossil record that he looked at. And he saw some species, and then hundreds of, tens of millions or whatever years later, something else. He thought, well, they must have displaced them. He didn't know about mass extinction events. And he wrote a whole part of his book on how bad the fossil record was. What we now know is that there has been this continuous pattern of newly emerging species coexisting with existing species. And because you may not know that, the data behind that, I'll show you quite a bit of data on that throughout the talk. And that's sort of one part of what is going on. Another part, it was mentioned, I like mathematics. And this is a way to show 4 differential equations in a way that might make it visually obvious what's going on. A differential equation describing how species A uses and competes for resource 1 and 2, how species B does that, and another differential equation for the dynamics of resource 1 and the dynamics of resource 2. So the line where I show the blue line, which says species A, it shows how much of these 2 resources this species, and with a right angle corner and this blue line, it means it's probably a plant going for something like nitrate versus phosphate, etc. The right angle corner means it has to have a certain amount of nitrate and phosphate to live optimally. That's at the corner of its isocline where it hits the green line. And if you look at this, species A can live on less amount of resource 1. Its straight up and down isocline there is at a lower level of R1, but it has a greater requirement for resource 2 compared to species 2. So species 2 is the best competitor for resource 2. It can live at a lower level. Species A and species A is the best competitor for resource 1. That's a trade-off. To get better at doing one thing, they are poor at doing something else. The question is, evolutionarily, you have to have this kind of a trade-off if you're going to explain diversity. For 2 species or 10 or 100 species to coexist, they have to be subject to the same trade-offs, the same constraints. If they're not, something can be better. For instance, here, with 2, a third can invade in between. That's intermediate between those 2, and it will coexist with them. You can see the sort of regions of coexistence written there. And then another one could invade with an isocline that hits the trade-off curve between A and C, another one between B and C, and all 5 of those could coexist, and other ones could coexist between them. In fact, every single point on that trade-off curve, assuming that organisms can never be better than that, every single point would represent a unique trait of a species where it is the best competitor under that environmental condition, that amount of resource 1 and resource 2 in a habitat. So, and let me tell you, this is so much faster than when I give my students the equations. It's a week long of lectures to try to get this point across. I'm hoping you see the big picture, what I'm aiming for. And if you're excited by the math, you can look it up in papers I published. But here's what happens if something is a superior competitor, like Darwin imagined, that comes in that actually can live on less of these resources than the other ones, that can break through this trade-off curve and can drive resources down to its green line, its isocline, and by doing so, have there be insufficient resources for either A, B, or C to keep being there. So this would be Darwin's superior species that came in and drove other things extinct. We don't see this in the fossil record. We see things, if you will, bound to the same trade-off curve, and because of that, coexisting with other species in a heterogeneous environment. So the evidence. When I started reading the paleo literature, I was amazed how many paleontologists sort of later in their career, when they've really seen the big picture around the taxa they had studied, said things like Benton and Everson said in this. They looked at tetrapod evolution. So the fish that crawled out of the ocean and became a tetrapod on land, if you will, and all the different things that came from that, and looked at the emergence of new species in the fossil record. And they said there's no evidence that rapidly speciating clades have reached a limit, nor are driving other clades to extinction. And they basically answered why that was so by talking about the morphology of the species they saw and how the morphological differences were indicative of ecological differences among the new taxa within a given clade and among the different clades. So the birds, the reptiles, et cetera, the mammals. And that's sort of just one little bit of evidence. Here's a wonderful book by Tim Flannery, who's a paleontologist who wrote a book about the last 65 million years, KT extinction event to now in the Americas and their paleoecology, and talked about how there have been many times during that 65 million years when mammals that evolved in Asia crossed over the Bering Land Bridge when it was there, and came into North America, and animals that evolved in North America crossed the Bering Land Bridge and went into Asia. And now time after time after time, these invasions occurred without any of the taxa in the invaded realm ever going extinct. And often, like horses evolved in North America, camels evolved in North America, they invaded Asia, went through Asia, down over the Strait of Turfis, down into Africa and so on, and they speciated and formed even more species that had come in. And he said one might have expected that successive waves of immigration would have caused the immediate extinction of some of the older lineages, which is what Darwin thought. And I would have thought that too if I hadn't read all this literature, though this is rarely the case. Instead, the new invaders and the longer established fauna often coexist for a considerable period. To a paleontologist, a considerable period is many millions of years. Another example, it's called the Great American Interchange. When I began my career 50 years ago, Africa and South America were hooked together. Oh no, that was 100 million years ago, sorry. And were pulled apart, and Africa and South America had been separate evolutionarily for 100 million years. And as South America came over below North America, they weren't hooked together at all. There's no way for animals to walk from one continent to the other until in the ring of fire that is there in the sort of near between the two continents, volcanic activity ended up forming Panama and Costa Rica and joined the two continents together. That happened about 3 or 4 million years ago. And when that happened, there was mass migration of mammals that had evolved for 100 or so million years, at least 50 million years, in North America with no linkage to anything in South America, invaded South America, mammals in South America with no evolutionary history in common with those of North America since 100 million years before, invaded North America, and they coexisted. And the typical fossil beds for mammals that are found report diversity increased, and number of genera increased about 50% after this invasion, with no known extinctions of anything caused by this. There had once been suggested that 12 species of notoungulates in South America had gone extinct because of the invasion. And more recent work on that showed they'd actually gone extinct before the invasion occurred, and they went extinct because climate change had gotten rid of the grasslands, turned them into forest that those grazers required, and they went extinct when their habitat disappeared. And that's true not for mammals only, but for birds, for plants, etc. Over and over, and paleontologists have looked at this, coexistence is the norm. Here's another one, which I think is quite interesting. The middle of North America used to be a shallow sea during the Ordovician, about 450 million years ago. And that sea had an invasion event, which increases diversity by about 40% for the marine invertebrates living in the bottom of the shallow sea. And this study looked at, I think it's around, I don't know, 70 or so different sites in North America before the invasion event, deeper down, during the invasion event, even deeper, sorry, after the invasion event on top, deeper down, during the invasion event, deeper down before the invasion event, 1,000,000 years before, during, and 1,000,000 years after. And they said there was no evidence of anything being driven extinct, even though diversity increased 40 or so percent, that these taxa coexisted with each other. At some local sites, some invader came in and took over some local region of this giant sea, but it never did it in a way which caused another species that was there to go extinct. Species became less abundant, as you would expect, they're competing, but there was no displacement of one species by an invader, even 1,000,000 years after the invasion had happened. So another one, this is done by Gary Vermeer, who is an amazing paleontologist, lost his eyesight as a child and identifies mollusk fossils by feel in ways that allow him to actually feel things that people can't even see. And he did a really interesting study on what happened about 3.5 million years ago when the Bering Strait opened, allowing the very rich mollusk fauna of the North Pacific to invade into the North Atlantic. About 200 different species of mollusks invaded into the North Atlantic, causing about a 7-fold increase in diversity. And none of the native species of the North Atlantic were driven extinct by this massive invasion. They all coexisted. He said, although biotic interchange may have many important biological consequences for the species in the recipient biota, they became less abundant, extinction is an unlikely consequence based upon his study. And I think I'm going to stop there. I think I threw away the next 10 slides into other examples like this, but I think this makes the point over and over and over again. When paleontologists look at the history of life on Earth, from the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago until now, diversity has increased because of migration between different realms. There's no evidence that newly evolved species are causing extinction of existing species over and over again. And the only mathematical logical theory that is consistent with that is to say that organisms have unavoidable trade-offs. And in fact, to say a very radical idea is that organisms that evolved in separate realms for tens of millions to 100 million years were still bound by the same basic underlying trade-off that they were unable to overcome. Now, I will show you in a bit that that trade-off might move very slowly, but it moves slowly enough that things seem to go extinct by other forces before they go extinct by the superiority of a slightly better trade-off. Do I speak too slowly? Yeah, no student has ever accused me of that. Yes.
So at the beginning you showed this like classic population ecology, like invader scenario, and they get really nice, much better than me. They get very complicated, like n-dimensional hyperspaces. And in undergrad, I did a lot of that, and a professor like you stood up and was like, look how beautiful these solved equations are, because this 6-dimensional hyperspace intersects this axis slightly lower than this other one, that this species is destined to go extinct. Are you saying that that's not true, or are you just saying that that effect is so weak that it might as well not be true?
I'm at least saying the latter. I'm saying for the amount of time that we have had higher organisms on Earth forming fossils that we can actually look at and identify them to species and identify some of the ecological aspects because of their morphology, we haven't seen that happen.
So if this other professor was arguing with you, what would you tell him? Like, that doesn't just say like what you're doing makes no sense and you shouldn't be doing these models.
Oh no, I mean I won a prize. There was 2 kinds of MacArthur Awards. There's one where they give you a lot of money. I didn't get that one. There's one where the prize you win is the ability to write a paper that's published as the first paper of the year in the Journal of Ecology, the American Journal of Ecology, to say whatever you want and they can't prevent you from doing it. So I talked about how things should evolve to become superior evolutionarily and cause extinctions. This was a 1999 paper. Before I knew everything I'm telling you, I was sure that what this other professor was saying was right. And I stuck my neck out in this paper, and I was totally wrong in retrospect. Maybe that's why nobody cites that paper anymore. I don't know. But I mean, logically, I would agree. That's what Darwin thought. And anybody who knows evolution, you think, well, lots of individuals, genetic variation, selection will favor better traits, and so on. So you have to ask yourself, why would something not be able to overcome a trade-off? And what I would say is this: all trade-offs are based upon allocation. An amino acid that is used to make one enzyme that does one chemical reaction cannot be used to make another one that does a different chemical reaction. A morphological structure that is made requires energy and material to make it, and energy to keep it functioning, and that energy material cannot go to some other function. And so I think because of that, if life is in fact evolving to be slightly better, it's happening at an incredibly slow rate now. I think if we went back before 500 million years ago, that back to the 3.5 billion when the first signs of life appeared, there were probably lots of things that evolved and caused other things to go extinct. We just don't see that happening in the recent past, the last 500 million years. Would he believe me? Or she? I didn't know. Well, anyway. So how do so many species coexist? I spent a lot of my time studying plants of the Great Plains. These are perennial grasses and forbs, legumes, grasses, and forbs. Relatively long-lived, 10, 20, 50 years for some of these species. In the region I work, there may be 300 or so species. You find maybe 100 species in a typical hectare of land, of tallgrass prairie. And having studied these, I found out some of these species are limited by soil nitrogen. They have a high requirement for it. Some by potassium, some by calcium. There are years and places where water is a major limiting factor. Light can be a big limiting factor. Taller plants get more light. A lot of them have dispersal as a major limiting force that influences their abundance, their ability to disperse. They have different physiologies. Each enzyme has a temperature optimum at which it works best, and most organisms have a whole series of enzymes that are organisms that can't control their body temperature that are all at the same optimal temperature. So some plants grow better in the cool part of the spring, some in the middle part of the summer, and some in the heat of the end of the summer, and they have enzyme systems that let them do that. But you can't be really good at growing at low temperature and equally good at growing at high temperature, because that's not how enzymes work. To make them work that way, you have to make the enzyme be much, much bigger, all these things holding that active site in place, and that means you took 3 or 4 or 5 times more amino acids to get the same function, and that's a big cost. Then you have a much lower growth rate. So a trade-off again there. So, and then when you look at these, we find trade-offs all the time between the ability to compete for N versus K versus Ca, the ability to compete for anything versus the ability to disperse. We find organisms that give up competitive ability to make them be more resistant to an herbivore or to a disease. So there is some multidimensional space. 6 dimensions, sure. 10 dimensions, maybe. I don't know. And the more dimensions it is, the less overlap and the less strong should be the competitive interaction. So with these factors, if factors like this lead to trade-offs, such as getting better for one thing makes you worse at something else, that could explain coexistence. And it does seem to explain coexistence of these species. And what these trade-offs mean is that each species ends up being a specialist. It does something better than any other species in the world can do it. And because of the trade-off, it does everything else not as good as other species can do it. And that specialist is very important for something else we'll talk about in a minute. So here, for instance, are the 3 main groups of plants we see in the tallgrass prairie. Poaceae, Fabaceae, and asterids, grasses, legumes, and non-legume forbs. And this shows their tissue concentrations of N, K, and Ca. And you can see these are fairly distinct. This is the most abundant species. We've now done that for the 60 most abundant species, and the things look pretty much like this, a bit more overlap, but they really are quite distinct. In fact, if you just use these traits and use these to divide these species into groups, sort of put them onto a tree based upon their levels of calcium, potassium, and nitrogen, you get a dendrogram like this, which is incredibly highly correlated with their phylogeny. What it says is that these requirements, these trade-offs, are evolutionarily deep in the grasses and the asterids and the legumes, the Fabaceae. They're evolutionary deep trade-offs these organisms don't really seem to be able to overcome. Well, the amount of N, P, K, etc. a plant needs really reflects its whole physiology, how it lives, how it gathers photosynthate, and how it makes things, and so on. And so it probably is no surprise that the ancient grasses that had a certain physiology and differentiated basically didn't change their physiology. They changed their morphology. They changed how much tissue went to leaves or roots or stems, or how much went to seeds, but their underlying biochemistry was really pretty much fixed in their evolutionary history, and that didn't change. So the grasses really are quite distinct from the forbs and the asterids. And these differences explain to a great extent why they coexist. And it's not just these plants here. There's the data from Helena Murilo Landau and Jill Wright, who work on Barro Colorado Island on rainforest in Panama. And here are two of their major families, the Fabaceae and the Moraceae of trees there. And you can look here, each dot is a species, and you can look at the amazing difference, phylogenetically constrained, between the Fabaceae and the Moraceae in Panama. Again, these are axes of differentiation which seem to be evolutionarily not very movable, and trade-offs between these big groups in terms of how much N, K, and Ca they require, and that would then influence how they might compete with each other and coexist and so on. So I'm now going to try to give you a three-dimensional diagram. So with N, K, and Ca. So you can sort of see the three axes there. And the little triangle there is a surface that's away from the origin that might show how much calcium or nitrate or potassium a given species requires. And each point on there is a specialization, some species that is best at that relative amount of calcium, potassium, and sodium. So each point in this plane, on this triangular plane, could be the trait of an individual species. So this is what I call a trade-off surface. As opposed to a trade-off line, a trade-off surface, you do it in 6 dimensions, you have a 6-dimensional trade-off surface populated by organisms with 5 dimensions, if you will. So something like this here, the different colors are supposed to suggest maybe the differences between the grasses, forbs, and legumes, or the Fabaceae and the Moraceae, different taxonomic groups having the same color, and sort of being at different points in this trade-off curve, on this trade-off surface, and basically doing better, being a better competitor in those regions, but still able to coexist with species in other regions, assuming the soil is variable in its calcium, potassium, or nitrogen content, which soils are quite variable that way. Okay, and here's an actual fitted trade-off surface done by Adam Clark, who was a student of mine a while ago. And the fit, it's hard to tell where those points are to that plane, but the R-squared for all those data points on the plane is 0.93. They're basically on that plane. And this is the trade-off between the ability to compete for nitrate and the ability of these species to disperse. Lower requirements for nitrate, what I call R star, how much nitrate they have to live, are associated with much poorer ability to disperse. To be a good competitor for nitrate, one of these perennial plants have to have a very large root system. And on its roots, it has to have on the cell surface these specialized enzymes that can grab a nitrate molecule, use an ATP, and dump it inside the cell and keep it from going back out again. And so the whole physiology of the uptake process requires energy, and it requires a voluminous root system to be able to get a lot of the nitrate. And by putting their biomass into that, they have much less biomass they can put into seed, which makes them poor dispersers. So again, a trade-off between dispersal ability, competibility, and also leaf nitrogen content as a measure of how efficiently they can turn the nitrogen they do get into new biomass. Three-way trade-off. This is really just a way to show a series of underlying equations, solve the equations, and the blue line shows you what is predicted to happen. The black line shows you what actually does happen for the summed abundance of all these species when they compete with each other and coexist. It really does a pretty good job at predicting, if you will, productivity based upon the underlying trade-off we see between efficiency of nitrogen use, compatibility for nitrogen, and ability to disperse. I must be talking fast. I'm excited. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. I'm excited. So let's go back to the great American interchange and to some of the other cases where we talked about major invasion events into a new biogeographic realm and coexistence of taxa. We can mathematically, my mathematical love was mentioned to you, so I'm not going to show you, I'm not really showing a lot of the math, but I'll show you the results of the math in a second. We can ask, well, what if an invading species really was superior, and yet it still coexisted with something for 1 million years or 5 million years? What would that mean? How much better could it be, and yet not drive something else extinct in that period of time? So we can calculate that. And this the math behind this is an article I published in the American Naturalist, which is a strange name for a journal that mainly publishes mathematics. But that is the name of the journal. And the first part, E here, are the proportion of species that should be driven extinct by an invader that has an advantage of D, where D is the proportional difference between its requirement, its trade-off curve, and the existing trade-off curve. If it's closer to the origin, it can live on less things. If it was, let's say, if D was 0.1, that would say it was 10% closer to the origin than the existing trade-off curve. And that's how many species should go extinct, where N is the total number of species there. And then you can also calculate how long it should take for extinction to occur. In my case, I said extinction would occur when an existing species had been driven to 1/1,000,000th of the level it had before the invasion occurred. And I could have made it any other proportion, but I thought that was pretty extreme, but you'd definitely call it extinct when it's 1/1,000,000th of its former abundance. And that time to do that is just 144 divided by the difference times the average mortality rate for an organism of that body size raised to the 0.9. And that's just solving differential equations that I came up with that. So what do you think these D values are? Well, here's the answer. Across all these cases, mastodons that came in to South America from North America, based upon their body mass and their likely mortality rate per year of 0.025, how long they coexisted before they're driven extinct by people, by the way, not by anything else, gave a D of 0.0022. And you can look across all these various cases, the mollusk invading, et cetera, neotropical rainforest invasions, lots of those things coming into South America from Africa over the last 20 million years, creating the most diverse tropical forest in South America, being the Amazonian rainforest. Well, the Amazonian, actually, the upper Amazon, Peruvian rainforest. But if you look at these things, the median value is 0.0008. 8 parts out of 10,000 is the biggest difference that is consistent with these things existing and not having caused something else to be 1/1,000,000th of its former abundance. And the median is 0.005, 5 parts out of 10,000. If I were to draw a trade-off curve that differed by 5 10,000ths next to an existing curve, you couldn't tell them apart. If you tried to measure this, you couldn't measure the difference. You could never gather enough data on any real organism to find out that something was 5 10,000ths better. That's the biggest difference there could be. So I personally don't think that evolution is not leading to things becoming absolutely better. It's the same thing that Darwin suggested. But I'm suggesting is that after 3.5 billion years of evolution on Earth, the advances that can be made are so incredibly tiny that we don't see them impacting extinctions and so on the way Darwin imagined it might be happening. Okay, so now we go to the next part of my talk, which is what we have suggested is that organisms are here and we have the diversity we have because of trade-offs among species. Where to become better at something, everything has to become worse at something else, that each species ends up being a specialist. The question is then, what happens to an ecosystem made up of many species if these species have these trade-offs? And this is work that Clarence Lehman and I did a while ago, 2001. We looked at 4 commonly used models of interspecific competition and used those models to predict how changing the number of species in an ecosystem would affect its productivity, its stability, its invasibility, and many other aspects of that whole system. And here, this just shows you some of the different models we used. So ecosystem productivity, the total abundance of all the plants competing with each other, or the total abundance of all of the herbivorous animals competing with each other for plants, et cetera, is its productivity here, and that's predicted to be an increasing function of diversity. In fact, the curve there is literally a prediction of one of these models, and they all really gave the same basic prediction. The stability of that biomass production, how variable it is from one time period to the next, also increases, predicted to increase basically linearly as diversity increases. As there are more and more species in the system, the mathematics says, because of these trade-offs, because each species is a specialist, because of these trade-offs, as there are more species, the system itself becomes more stable. It varies less in response to perturbations in the environment. the actual individual average species. Clearly, when other things invade, a species on average is less abundant because of all these other species. But it doesn't drop enough in abundance to prevent having the productivity of the whole system actually increase. And that's because these species are different. They mainly inhibit themselves more than they inhibit anything else. Each species mainly inhibits its other members of its own species and not that much on things that are ecologically different from it. The stability of individual species slightly decreases, even though the sum of them is a linearly increasing function of diversity. And you can extend theory. One is invaders have to live on whatever the unconsumed resources are. And that means that as there are more and more species and these resources are driven by higher diversity to lower levels, it's harder for an invader to get enough resource to live and reproduce and actually invade that system. Individual species are less abundant at higher diversity, which means their pathogens are also likely to be less abundant because the pathogen effect, if you will, the R naught of a disease depends upon the density of the host. And the density of the host is lower at higher diversity. And there's another feedback that I'll show you, which we didn't expect at all, and that is that these ecological differences among taxonomic groups and their composition of nutrient composition makes them create more fertile soils. So here, this is the result of one of our long-term experiments. It was the first experiment to a field experiment to explore whether or not the number of species in an ecosystem actually mattered for the functioning of that ecosystem. So each dot is a plot. There were 150 some plots. The plots were 9 by 9 meters in size, each randomly planted with either 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 species. And each plot with a composition of the species randomly chosen from a pool of 16 native prairie grassland perennial plants. And the green circle is the single most productive species growing in monoculture. And what you can see by the dotted line going across here is that 16 species plots, every single plot of the 30-some replicates of 16 species is more productive than that single species is in monoculture. And so one effect of diversity is that systems become much more productive at higher diversity. In fact, in this case, these systems are 230% more productive for 16 species plots than for the average species growing in monoculture. And if you just were to plant just the single best species in monoculture, they are 75% more productive than that is. So even if you chose the single best species, like we do with agricultural crops, mixtures of species, because of these trade-offs, perform much better. Some more math. I just did this. I had to show it to you. I just did this a few weeks ago. So much fun. I used the classic, what are called Bloch-Volterra competition equations. Any of you ever heard of those? Good, good, good. You can use those and calculate how changing diversity influences the summed abundance of all the competitors. And it is highly dependent on what's called alpha. I couldn't find out how I got an alpha to come out of my keyboard, so I called it A. I know you can. I'm sure you can all do this. I'm a dinosaur. I don't know how to do that. But the graph shows, compared to the average carrying capacity of all the competing and coexisting species, where I call the average of that K, shows how many Ks of production you expect to have as a function of the strength of competition alpha. An alpha of 1 means that a competitor is ecologically identical to another species. An alpha of 0 means it doesn't compete at all. And the dashed line there, the blue dashed line, the parallel to the x-axis, is the 230% more production. It's the carrying capacity, the sum of all the abundance of the species being 3.2 times the carrying capacity, which is 230%, 3.2, 230%. And the red line shows what the average alpha should be to give that, which is right around 2 point, I don't know, what is that, 2. There's 2.4, something like that. I can't quite read it there. It's something like that. And then I actually use all the data on species abundance that's changing through time to calculate the alphas for each of these species and these 16 species plots. And the mean value of all those alphas is 2.51. It's pretty close. And a value of, most ecologists think alphas are more like 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. But because of the dimensionality of the trade-offs that these species face, these alphas are actually quite a bit lower than that. It's lower than I thought they would be before I did this work. But again, it's consistent with this differentiation among species, leading them to be able to coexist, and having higher diversity lead to a marked increase in the productivity of the plants that compete with each other, of the herbivores that eat the plants, and of the predators that eat the herbivores. The same logic applies to all those trophic levels. They're all competing within a trophic level. The same math applies, the same logic, and so on. Stability. Each dot here is the measured temporal stability of the biomass in a plot for a 5-year period. Or actually, it's the mean across all of those for all the plots at a given level of diversity. And what you can see is that going from the typical monoculture to the typical 16 species plot, that stability is an increasing function of diversity. In fact, it's also, I showed it's also an increasing function of time. Plots have become more and more stable through time later on than they were initially. So, but a very strong effect of diversity on stability as predicted by theory. Because we've changed the plants in these plots, and they have whatever herbivores might come in there as insect herbivores, we're able to look at the whole food web, that insectivorous food web that lives on all the plants in these grassland plots that we have. And there's an interesting feature, which is that the abundance of predators increases with plant diversity. And as they increase, it decreases the abundance of herbivores. And so in the most diverse plant communities, we have a much higher proportion of predators to herbivores, a food web shift that I think is quite interesting. It's actually what you'd expect to have happen as you increase the productivity of a food web. Invaders, these are the numbers of plants that we didn't plant in the plots that invaded plots, and their abundance. So the invader diversity fell by about, 15 to about 5, about a factor of 3. 1/3 the number of species were able to invade high diversity plots than the typical monoculture. And it's incredibly highly correlated with just the amount of unconsumed nitrate left in the soil. Now, these are fungal diseases of plant species. Excuse me. And as I suggested before, at higher diversity, each plant species is less abundant. And because it's less abundant, it has a lower incidence of attack by the species-specific fungal pathogens. And finally, I want to mention that as these plots actually have been increasing in productivity through time. The red colors are the first few years of the experiment, and the blues are the later years of the experiment. And biodiv is just what we call the biodiversity experiment. And so productivity is increasing through time, and is increasing through time because of an interesting feedback effect. It comes from the differences between these coexisting species and their calcium, nitrogen, potassium concentrations. For a soil to be fertile, it has to have more organic matter, and it has to have more of all the various chemical elements plants require. And the plants that are high in an element add more of that back into the soil when they drop leaves and die and get decomposed and so on. And so here's what's actually happened. From the beginning of the experiment in 1994, the green dots are what the soils were like chemically before the experiment began. We pulled the cores before the experiment began. And 2017 shows what they're like now. Soil carbon has gone up greatly. Soil nitrogen has gone up greatly. Soil potassium has gone up, so has calcium, and it goes up greater at greater diversity. In fact, it's these very processes that created the fertile soils that are the breadbasket of North America. The prairie grassland soils are the soils that grow the corn, the wheat, the soybeans, etc. In North America. And they are fertile only because they had a high diversity of plants living in them. Without having grasses, forbs, and legumes, all three of those groups, without any, you take away one of those, take away the forbs, there's no potassium coming in. Without the legumes, there's no calcium or nitrogen coming in. Without the grasses and their huge root systems, there's no organic matter, nitrogen, organic matter, carbon coming in. It takes all of those to create a fertile soil. So, if you will, there's a sort of a debt that society owes diversity that way that we don't really think about. Where we get our food is from fertile soils, and those fertile soils are created by organisms. And in fact, it takes a diversity of organisms with a diversity of chemical compositions, which allow them to coexist, to create those soils. Finally, see, it's hard to fit your whole life into just 50 minutes. You don't mind if I go for 5 years, do you? I said 5 years, you know, I was joking. 5 days, maybe not. So here's one last graph. This looks at all the different long-term experiments we've done at my research site in Minnesota. We have 22 square kilometers of land. That's oak savanna, prairie grassland, and so on, that we do this work. It's a large area. And here's showing the first blue bar, A, shows the effect of going from 16 species down to 1, how that changes productivity, or going from 16 down to 2, or so on. Or what happens when you add a lot of nitrogen. 95 kilograms of nitrogen is about what many farmers add to grow corn or grow wheat. It's an immense amount of nitrogen. You can see that doesn't actually give as big an increase in productivity as you get by having going from 1 to 16 species. Increasing plant diversity from 1 to 16 gives you as much productivity, more productivity than adding an immense amount of fertilizer rate comparable of nitrogen. Watering or not watering has an effect, but it's small compared to changing diversity, as is adding CO2 or imposing drought or having herbivores present or absent or burning it or not burning it. All the basic forces that before were thought to be the big things that controlled the grasslands of North America, drought, herbivory, fire, and nitrogen, are important, but they're not at all as big in their impact as changing diversity. Diversity is everything we know now, the single most important variable that determines how productive, how stable, how invasible, and how well an ecosystem functions. So I have a student right now working on intercropping, growing different plants together. It's a commonly believed reason to get a way to get increased yield off croplands. And it looks like from sort of the first meta-analysis she's doing that you can get about 20 to 30% more harvestable yield by growing 2 crops together than by growing each crop by itself. And it'll be fun to see how all that works out. We had a paper in Nature that showed that countries that grew a larger number of crops actually had a more stable food supply for their nation. Again, pretty simple, straightforward ideas. Cultural diversity, I like being on intellectually diverse teams because I know that each of us thinking differently is better at finding an answer than each of us thinking only in our own monospecific way of doing so. So I'm now going to just spend a couple minutes, a very fast part, on what I think is, hopefully I've convinced you that diversity really matters, that the functioning of ecosystems and the services they provide to society really do depend upon how many species they have in them. We know we've caused extinction. During the Pleistocene in the Americas, people combined with climate change made 130 large animals go extinct. We know that we're a super species. We're no longer bound by the same trade-offs that bind all other organisms on Earth. Because of our ability to accumulate knowledge, to make tools and to use these tools, we can do things that no other organism can do. We can easily cause anything we want to go extinct. We have the power to do that. We often do it inadvertently without even trying. By just living our lives, we cause extinctions. And it is very likely that many more extinctions are on our way. I will just sort of show a bar. We had a paper that came out in Nature where we asked questions along the lines of where are we heading, what kind of impacts are we going to have on diversity, what might that lead to, and so on. The biggest reason for causing extinctions on Earth is land clearing. We clear land for agriculture, we clear land for logging and so on. We clear land for development, roads, cities, houses, etc. And those are the biggest reason for species to be threatened with extinction. If we look at what the world is likely to do between 2010, when he wrote this paper, or before he wrote the paper, and 2060, looking at population growth and income growth around the world, we can ask how much more land might be needed, would be used to be cleared for agriculture or for other uses. And the darker colors here show ratios of like 5 times more land at the highest rate compared to what they have right now. And you can see there's going to be a big impact, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and then in some other parts of Asia and the Americas in terms of future effects. And these bars show extinction risks measured using by the IUCN. The darker bars on the bottom are what the risks are right now. The bars above are our projected extinction risks based upon the predicted increase in population and economic activity in various parts of the world. And what you can see is these numbers right now, for instance, for tropical Asia, the 2010 number, the highest is for mammals, the greatest risk of extinction for mammals is right now in tropical Asia. They have the highest rates. 80-some% of the large mammals are threatened with extinction in that area. And what this says is that is going to almost double by the year 2060, and that Africa, which has the lowest threat to large mammals, is likely to have threats much greater than are already occurring in Asia right now by 2060 because of income and population growth and so on. So lastly, what I want to say is, and this could be a talk in its own right, but basically we know what we need to do to prevent extinctions. We need to help people in developing low-income countries get much more food from a unit of land. It's called closing their yield gaps, helping their yields increase. Means they don't need to clear as much land to feed themselves. We know we need to protect areas, and these areas need to be larger, and they need to be effectively protected to help prevent extinctions. I'll talk tomorrow about non-food crops. We have an amazing increase in the use of fertile land to produce fuels for cars, fuels for airplanes is the next thing coming along, to produce better clothing fibers, believe it or not, by growing corn and so on. Healthier diets help. We need to reduce food waste, and clearly we have to stop climate change. Right now, climate is not a big issue for extinction risk, but if climate keeps changing, it'll become a fairly big issue. So with that, I would love to hear any questions or thoughts you might have, and I am really apologize for taking too much of your time.
Great. So we'll kick off some questions both here, and also if any of the online audience want to ask questions, just type them in brief note in the chat, and I invite you to speak. I'll just kick off with one that intrigued me. So if I understand correctly, to date, invasion has been described as the biggest cause of extinctions throughout the Holocene, particularly small islands and non-native species coming onto that. How does that story square with what you were talking there about species learning to coexist?
Yeah, well, yeah, in oceanic islands, far from mainlands, where organisms came in and speciated in the absence of the typical predators and diseases and so on, those have been very susceptible to extinction. But when you look at plant invasions into continental areas or mammal invasions into continental areas, very few extinctions have happened because of that. So it's only for these sort of evolutionarily divergent habitats where extinctions occur, and they occur when totally different kinds of attacks than those organisms had ever experienced in their evolutionary history on that island come in and cause extinctions. So that is the big exception.
So your framework is those D numbers are, the differences are so large between the invading and
I mean, organisms that where they came from lived in trees with nests of birds, let's say, with nests that are hidden from predators and so on, started putting nests on the ground on an island where there were no predators against them and so on. So there were things evolved in response to the forces that affected them, and they had forces that affected them that are very different than occur on any of the continents from which they came. And so they sort of unevolved many traits that had been beneficial. And because of, like the fish that live in caves that lose their eyes, there's active selection against eyes in a cave because the eyes are expensive. And there'd be active selection against ways to protect oneself from a predator when there are in a habitat where there are no predators. But the cost of that was when things invaded, they went extinct.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, we'll open up to the floor. Any questions? This is for the online audience.
Thank you for the talk. It was super interesting. And to me, it was very interesting to hear about the fact that diverse tree plantations actually make the soil more rich in nutrients. But it also made me think of the soils of the Amazon, which are also super poor in nutrients. And it's kind of been of a mystery how it can support such a diverse range of trees. And I wonder your thoughts on whether the diversity of trees itself, it's maintaining itself with the nutrients. I don't know if my question was understood.
No, it's a good question. I hadn't thought about the Amazon soils. I mean, there you have climate, which leads to very rapid decomposition of organic matter. And I don't know if it'd be fun to find. I mean, there are some now biodiversity experiments being done in tropical habitats. There's one that Andy Hector is doing, I think, on Borneo, if I remember right, where he's changing the number of tropical trees. It'd be fun to. I don't have an answer. This is a really good question, and I like that question because I never thought about that question before. So it's why it's fun to give a talk. I have no answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, well, you're whoever. Okay.
Thank you very much. Lovely talk, by the way. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to ask, because as you mentioned that biodiversity is, you know, the single most important variable in increased productivity. What do you see as sort of the most significant barriers in changing the way that we, you know, that we do agriculture globally and shifting from our, you know, use of fertilizers and monocultures to adopting biodiverse agricultural practices instead?
I think there have been enough studies showing the 20 to 30% increase in total yield from having a more diverse agricultural cropping system. But it's only really been successful in areas where the agriculture is not mechanized. It basically, with mechanization, a farmer in the United States can farm 500 hectares of land by him or herself. They have machines that plant crops that are 100 feet wide, that harvest them that are 100 or more feet wide, et cetera. And one person can drive those at a pretty good speed and take care of 500 hectares of land all by themselves. If we had machinery that was designed to take a 4-foot wide swath of corn and a 4-foot wide swath of soybeans or of corn and wheat, and handle it that way, I think farmers could make more money. And we could get a lot more food off a piece of land. But right now, there are no such machines. They're easily made. We know how to make each specific machine that harvests corn or wheat or soybeans, and we could know how to put them by each other, but nobody has done it. And so I think it's going to be a bootstrap problem. We have to get enough people interested in this that some company will actually invest money in this and take a chance. And I've suggested this to some big agricultural equipment companies, and they laugh at me. So far, I've had no success.
We'll take some in the middle. There were some hands up. You pass this microphone back.
Thank you. So I am familiar with some sites in Europe where they actually use non-mechanized agriculture to produce like organic crops. And if you are interested, you can look into the roses in Bulgaria. So Bulgaria is the biggest producer of roses. And they produce the roses organically, so no tractors, no pesticides, no nothing. But this roses grow in a monoculture. And as your figures show, this is kind of what's happening in Bulgaria as well. So the land keeps getting, the fields keep expanding, although the production of roses decreases because they are growing in a monoculture. And basically, I was investigating this, and I was thinking about the same thing, and I came across some of your studies showing this increase in biodiversity does increase yield, although the wall that I hit in my research was something like, okay, but how do you actually explain to these farmers that they need to do this, and how long would this take? Because yes, increase in diversity does increase production, but what's the time frame that you expect that to actually be felt by these farmers, and how would you sell this idea to somebody whose livelihood is basically at risk?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of organic flowers. It appeals to me. I tried to convince the person who owns the biggest flower shop business in Minnesota that he should invest in selling wild-grown prairie flowers. I thought good reason to restore prairie, right? Go out and pick the flowers and sell them, and they're organic, nothing done. He didn't buy that. I have a hard time selling people on ideas, I guess. So, and for normal crops, annual crops, you get the benefit the first year you try it. For roses, I have no idea how long it might take. They're long-lived plants. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much for your talk. And you kept referring back to 50 years of experience of research, which threw me back for 22 years ago when I was in Brazil, and you were a massive reference on my basic ecology module, on my vegetation ecology module, on my ecosystem ecology module. So as I was thinking about it, I have a non-academic question, which was, if you could answer what would be your one legacy after 50 years of research, what would that be?
Well, let me see, this right leg or left leg? See, I'm not sure. I guess I would, one, hope that people look at what I would say is the big picture. This is the only planet we'll ever live on. There's no other planet that will ever support human life, unlike what Elon Musk, the idiot, thinks. And with as many people as we have, becoming as rich as we are, without trying, we're causing lots of problems. And we really have to take where we live seriously. I guess I would love to have people take the attitude that that we as a global society have to become the force sustaining nature. Because if we don't have that attitude, we're going to destroy it without even wanting to or trying to. We just, by how we live our life, we do that. I guess I would hope that would be, if that could happen, I'd be totally delighted. I'd be smiling in my grave.
Hi, very nice talk. I actually, a lot of my PhD chapters based on your like R-star theory framework. And I was like, when I read your papers, I was surprised, like given this large amount of, species diversity you can find in tropical forests and in other like diverse system. You probably cannot find that many limiting factors that allow these trade-offs to happen across different types of resources. So I've been like keeping like trying to seek, okay, if multiple species compete for a single type of resources, is there a trade-off that among these species that can explain why they can coexist under certain, type of resources? And I found like I published another paper also in an American Naturalist talking about this hierarchical like resource exploitation that allows species to preempt some resources, but a trade-off between their preemption ability and the R-star value need to be there to allow this species to coexist. I wonder, like, if you look at the phylogenetic tree, tree you have for the specialists in different resource types, do you think that hierarchical resource exploitation strategy might explain the species diversion under the group of plants that are specialized on a certain resource type?
Yeah. Yeah, there's been some wonderful math. This first done by Dick McGehee, professor of math, and Rob Armstrong, one of his students, and then later by other people who are more ecological, that has shown how plants can exploit pulses and actually generate and create pulses and grab resources when they're cheap and use them when they're needed. It's like what bears do. The bears feed a lot in the summer and build up body mass, like I must be a bear, and then use it to live through the winter. So the same thing can happen. That's a whole other trade-off that can lead to coexistence, and there are many organisms that sort of follow that. There are an incredible number of trade-offs I didn't even get a chance to talk about. I sort of collect these trade-offs. They're fun things to understand, and that's a very important one.
Thanks. You've given a very sort of competition-dominated view of the world and paradigm, but there's a lot of interest in exploiter-mediated coexistence, so predators and parasites and density dependence, allowing coexistence or even driving it. So how do you separate out the importance of exploiters from just pure competitive effects?
They are all important. The mathematics on multi-trophic level interactions is not yet very complete. I actually have a new grad student who is an undergrad physics, and I'm sending him on the mystery tour of explaining how intertrophic level interactions, herbivores eating plants, predators eating herbivores, combined with trade-offs within and among, how that leads to the diversity that we see. Clearly, the multi-trophic level interactions really matter. The evidence that's out there is very clear. I didn't talk about them because I don't really have a good context for them right now, but I do think it's incredibly important.
Yes, hi. Do I go or? Okay, yeah, thanks. So focusing more on like animal species biodiversity and like the general Earth ecosystem as a whole, and not controlled environments designed by humans for food production, for example. I understand that humans have largely escaped these like natural trade-offs that you mentioned. And basically wherever we are, there's less biodiversity. We seem to be like a threat for biodiversity. So I was wondering, do you think it's possible to reintegrate human systems into biodiversity models, not as an external disturbance? Or do you think that biodiversity protection is only possible in reserves and spaces and environments that are separated from human activity?
I have a hard time imagining 8 billion people making it without us sort of separating ourselves from lots of natural systems. I really, if we fell back to 1 or 2 billion, which maybe will happen with, but typical fertility rates are less than 2.1 right now. As that keeps going, in 100 years from now, maybe we can do it. But right now, I really have a hard time imagining that happening. I really can't see how. When you look at, humans are my other favorite organism to study. I've gathered all this data on all the traits of what we consume, whether it's metal or grains or whatever it might be, what we consume, how we get it, what impact there is of getting that, how much energy we consume, et cetera, and what seems to control that. I don't think we're ever going to have the self-restraint to let that happen, but we might be able to have the self-restraint to set aside enough reserves, et cetera, and save nature in some other spots.
Thanks.
Right. Just a quick word for Darwin here. It's always nice to find that he got something wrong because it increases our intellectual diversity. But I wonder if there is a semantic issue here because, as you well know, he used species very much like we use alleles or mutant today for within species competition for the creation of adaptation. And you are more concerned with ecological competition between species when you discuss invasions or things of that sort. Is not what Darwin had in mind when he used the word species. So maybe he did get it wrong, but I think the way you presented this, there are two slightly different issues. How do we create adaptation and more efficient allele for some metabolic function that's cause relative fitness? That's what we call relative fitness, is the difference in representation in the population within a species of a particular characteristic. So haven't you been using the two terms the way we use species, attributing that to Darwin, but he used the word in a different way?
It could be true. And I actually didn't feel like I was being at all critical of Darwin. I mean, the fossil record he had available to him was slight. I mean, I would say the most interesting idea I've ever learned in my life is evolution. I could never imagine trying to understand what I do as a biologist without understanding evolution. And Darwin had a very incomplete fossil record, which led him to make the suggestions he made. So I don't consider it a critique at all. I mean, if I'm 95% right in my life, I'm lucky to be 50% right. Darwin's 99 point something. I mean, it's just that I wanted to make the point though, because I think I wrote a paper in 1999 where I said just what Darwin had said without knowing Darwin had said it. And I found out it was wrong. I think I may have briefly mentioned that. No, I don't, because I really, yeah. I mean, he really did talk about extinction being caused by it. So, I mean, that's not a mistake. That's what I quoted. New species causing extinction of existing species. I don't think he meant genes within a species. I mean, he saw dinosaurs disappear and mammals come on Earth and thought that's what happened, basically.
Yeah, I think I think there's just a semantic confusion in that area because he didn't use species as we do, but you are right that he sometimes jumped to talk about how species compete with each other. But then he was thinking his great emphasis was how you create adaptation, and we don't have an alternative. You haven't talked about that particular problem.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what he had mostly in mind.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take one or two more questions.
Don't people want to escape?
Thank you so much for that delightful and thought-provoking talk. I just had a question about the list of things that you provided at the end to stop extinction, and I noticed that the restoration of degraded ecosystems was not explicitly mentioned. Maybe it falls under the protected area bullet point, but I'm just wondering, what do you think is the role of restoring ecosystems?
I will add it to my list. Thank you. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. And there are many times when it could and should be done. About 500 million hectares of land has been cleared and used for agriculture and abandoned over the last 40 or so years. And restoring that would have major benefits. And so, yes, thank you for noticing my mistake. I appreciate that.
When you masters in rebranded in nature recovery.
And could I ask just one more quick question? So with agricultural productivity and thinking about including more species, what about intraspecific diversity of crops? So I once worked with potato farmers in Peru where they grew 80 different varieties of potatoes in one plot. Do you have any research about what that type of level of diversity could mean for agriculture?
Yeah, the same logic that says that species that differ ecologically can increase the productivity of a system happens for genetic diversity within. So I mean, a hybrid crop is more productive because a hybrid crop tends to have two alleles at each locus, two different alleles. That's what hybrids do. You have a pure line and a pure line, you cross them, you basically double the genetic diversity within an individual. There's some classic work done in the 60s and 70s at University of California, Davis, that showed that if you took various distinct lines of wheat and grew the seeds of those all together, you got more yield than growing any one of them by itself. So yes, increasing any kind of diversity tends to have those kind of benefits. And I would hope we would do a lot more with increasing diversity within even a monoculture from what we have right now. These poor people, they want to escape.
That was a great talk. Thank you very much. Given that agriculture currently is not working particularly well in the sense of it's being quite destructive, and there are people who are trying to make it better, if you were given the all-inclusive power to imagine what agriculture would look like, say, either in the US, UK, or globally, what would you start by changing if you were?
Well, I would want to use inputs much more efficiently than we do right now. Right now, the farmers make more profit by applying more fertilizer. But I was a co-author on a paper by some economists I collaborate with that showed that the nitrogen applied to corn costs about $20 billion a year in healthcare costs to people who live near the corn because of the ammonia that's in the air that makes PM 2.5 that causes heart and lung problems. And yet the farmers are making $5 billion profit off that same corn. So the total benefit to society is negative $15 billion. And so I would like us to, and we said there's some really easy ways to take care of this that cost almost nothing to farmers. But we don't have, the United States does not have policies that rein in farmers. Farmers are the holy cows of our country, if you will. They get to do whatever they want with almost no environmental controls on them. So I would want to change those sorts of things. There are so many logical things we can do that make agriculture in total better for society that come at a very minor cost. I would put the money that just pays farmers to grow crops into paying them to grow them better, for instance, in the United States. And those things, that would probably be the number one thing I would do. And then after that, I would like to find better ways to change diets. I don't think that what we're doing right now is going to do it. I think we need to, I was on the Wellcome Trust Board for a program that was trying to change diets. I kept saying, we're making a mistake. Why are we funding these academics? We should hire advertising companies. And you're going to laugh. Everybody laughed at me when I said that. You didn't laugh, at least. That was nice of you. But because advertisers know how to sell things. And why don't we have them selling the things that are actually better for you than the things that are worse for you? I mean, we should be hiring chefs to make the most delicious vegan food you can have. And their vegan food's getting a lot better. But there still are reasons why people who try it don't have that become their whole lifetime choice of meals. Anyway, they're just, there are lots of things like that that I think would be wonderful to do, that would take a different kind of regulatory system that wouldn't all be about profit for current corporations, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. I think we'll wrap up there. It's a reminder of Professor Tilman's seminar tomorrow, which is very relevant to the agricultural questions: feeding the world while preserving Earth's livability, the biofuel barrier. That's the Martin School at 5 o'clock tomorrow. Please join me in thanking